Um, what we're going to cover, or I'm going to start covering, is travel reimbursements. We do get a lot of questions about these, and we can kind of understand why. It seems like, travel should be pretty straightforward. I've worked for the state for 33 years now, and I know if I don't follow my travel policy, I don't get paid, and so you think it should be pretty straightforward, but it's not. And there are a lot of questions and a lot of things that are coming up that are causing some conflicts, and so that's why we're kind of going to want to go over this. Some of this you've already heard before, so bear with me, but for some of you it will be new. Basically, we're going to talk about, from our perspective, what we're looking at when we come out to audit your travel claims, your travel reimbursements, what we're looking for, what we're going to find exceptions on. And with the exception of state-called meetings, which we'll probably be talking about later this afternoon, reimbursements are based on what your county policy is. So when we come into audit, we are looking at those claims against your county policy, except for those few that are covered by statute. So the more detailed your policy is, the better we're able to determine compliance with that policy. And it's really important that everyone in your county knows, every department, every person that may be traveling and may be expecting reimbursement, exactly what they can be reimbursed for and can't. And it's a lot easier if they know before they go out than when they come back with these receipts saying we want our money now, and you're saying that's not covered. It's very important. I always like to know for sure what is covered and what's not. So it's really good to have a detailed policy and make sure it is available. Another area that we get, not necessarily counties, but statewide, that we see with travel claims is we do see fraud. We do see that is an area where people try to get some things by y'all. So it's really important that you do pay attention to the travel claims. You cannot prevent all fraud as much as we'd like to. It's simply not possible. But if you have a clear, detailed policy, you're going to close the door on a lot of opportunities to misuse that policy. And the less clear it is, the more you open those doors for those type of opportunities. And that doesn't mean that no matter how well it's written, that a situation is not going to come up that you didn't foresee, you didn't think about, never occurred to you that this was going to happen, and it will. So, there's just no way to be 100% cover everything. But if you do have exceptions, it's a good time to relook at your policy and see if maybe you need to do some modifications or do some more work on it, some more clarifications. We get a lot of, as I said earlier, we get a lot of calls asking if certain things from travel are okay, sometimes from the auditor's office, some from the employees saying, why won't they pay this? Why are they telling me that this isn't covered? And I will tell you, first of all, our #1 response back to that is, what is your county policy? Because we start with that. So we're not trying to pass the buck. That's important. What your county policy is very important. But again, there can be situations that you did not foresee. For example, we might have somebody call in and say, well, can I get overnight lodging? And you'll say, what is your policy? Well, the policy is you have to be 50 miles away, but it's the middle of winter, and it's going to be dark when we get out, and the roads are going to be bad, and travel is going to be difficult. So that may be something where you need to have something in your policy that deals with that situation, if it does come up, if you're doing meetings in the winter, where that exception is going to be allowed, under what circumstances, what kind of approvals are needed before that is allowed. And so again, we know there's a lot of things that we require you to do, a lot of duties that you perform as auditor. They don't always make sense to you, but if they're required by statute, you have to do them anyway. And the travel's not one of them, because that is definitely, again, unless it's those specific situations covered by statute, that really is up to your county. When we're looking at travel claims, we again are looking at, do they comply with your policy? And as long as your policy basically covers a reasonable expense and it is definitely county business, we're not going to really question the policy itself. So we're looking at that policy and looking at those claims in regard to that policy. So if we come out to do an audit and we look at the claim and we look at your policy and it doesn't fit, then we're going to have an exception. And we're probably going to tell you about it. And if it's depending on the materiality, how many times it happens in the sample that we're looking at, it could be a finding in your report. So it's really important that you not everybody understands your policy, but these kind of exceptions that you find and deal with before we ever get there for the audit. So I guess a kind of rule of thumb, if you're looking at a claim and you're questioning whether it should be paid or not, I will guarantee you that your auditor, your FE, field examiner coming out is going to have that same question. So it's a good idea to get it addressed right then. And if it's necessary to go back to your counsel and get some approvals or get some modifications to get that paid, do it then. It's a lot easier to do it then than have to worry about it a year later when we come in to start looking at that. Okay. So number one, your policy should be in writing. I know it kind of goes without saying, but you really need to have it in writing so that it is accessible to everybody and so that it is concrete in that way. It can be done through an ordinance. If you choose, it can be personnel. It could be in your employee handbook or county procedures, policies and procedures manual. In some way, it does need to be accessible. If it's an employee handbook that everybody gets a copy, if it's somewhere on your website for your staff only that they can access it, if it's an ordinance, if it's in your code of ordinances. And it needs to be reviewed, as we kind of talked about a little bit. If you have exceptions, of course, you do need to review your policy and see how you want to deal with those exceptions. But also, it needs to be reviewed as things change. Technology changes, responsibilities change. You may not have ever had an out-of-state travel, and now something's come up with your sheriff department or with someone where out-of-state is going to be required for a training or a meeting. So it's a good thing to review that policy and keep it updated, keep it, I want to say fluid, keep it to where it's not written, it's written in stone for checking your claims, but that it is open to modifications when necessary. Okay, on this slide, there are some of the things that you might want to consider when you're putting that policy together, or if you're reviewing one you currently have. So some things that you might want to address, as we talked about earlier, the distance to a location under which an employee will be considered in travel status, and so eligible to spend the night at a hotel. How far away do you have to be? Do you have to be, is it to be an all-day meeting or a half-day meeting, or, you need to work all of that out. Are there any extenuating circumstances that could be an exception to this rule, and what kind of approval or pre-approval or documentation needs to accompany that claim for payment if there is an exception to that. Number of hours, again, that you're working before you can get meal reimbursements. We do at the state, we have a subsistence or a per diem while we're in travel status, but it varies. If I leave halfway through the day, then I may only get dinner. If I leave before 6 o'clock in the morning, I get all 3 meals covered, and there's a certain amount for each meal. It's, we have a slide on it later, but it's $26 for the day, but that is prorated if you're only in travel status part of the day. So those are kinds of things you want to look at so someone knows before they go what kind of reimbursement they're going to be getting. Cost of hotel rooms, is there a limit on what we're being reimbursed for a night in a hotel room? Are there different rates for different parts of the state? Is there a different rate if you go out of state? Are there exceptions to that? And what kind of approvals need to be done for those exceptions to get those covered by the policy? Are any other things including, like parking fees, valet service, room service, internet service, are tips reimbursed? We have questions on that. How much, can I do a tip? What if they say I can only do 15% and I want to pay 20%? It needs to be in the policy. If you have it addressed before they go out, then they know what will be reimbursed. And if they want to pay 20 and you're only going to reimburse the 15, you've already got it in writing. They know that ahead of time. Most of, again, it's be reasonable, what's common practice. So again, we aren't questioning the policy at this point. We're questioning if the claim is in compliance with that policy. Mileage is always a big question. There is no statute that says there is a particular mileage that has to be paid by all units of government in Indiana. The mileage rate, again, except for those travel situations that are covered by statute, is within the discretion of the county. So again, it's you decide what it is, but it should be in writing and it should be implied consistently throughout your county. Meal reimbursement, as we talked about, are you going to pay the actual cost? Is there going to be a limit to how much your cost? I know this seems kind of crazy, but some people will, I've seen travel claims where, they go for a $50 meal. Is that something you want to pay for, it's your county policy, but you have to think, is that something that you want to pay? Is that the best use of your county money? And if there's not a limit, it could be $100. Where are you going to draw that line? If it's not actual cost, is there a per diem for the day, and how much, for how many meals? And you can do a per diem for travel expenses other than hotel and mileage costs, which can cover you. In your per diem, you need to state what is covered, whether it's just meals, whether it's meals and tips and parking, you just need to be really clear on what you're covering in that per diem. How you're going to pay that per diem, a lot of times you don't require receipts. If you're given per diem for a certain amount, you just pay based on the travel status. However, some counties do require receipts because they want to make sure that their per diem is reasonable, or that they've actually getting those meals. In a case where the meal is provided for that day, you might want to reduce, well, the state does, you might want to reduce the per diem for that day because the meal has been provided to them. And again, I talked a little bit about it. If you are starting to see out-of-state travel, that is something you want to address in that. A lot of times that can be more expensive, so you want to look at, some places will establish a per diem for in-state and a per diem for out-of-state, or rates, hotel rates for in-state, hotel for out-of-state. They might adjust the mileage that they're willing to pay if you're traveling a greater distance. And again, it's your policy. It is something you can think about, something you could add to that. How are you going to deal with airline costs, car rental costs? How do you get the reservations? Are you going to, do they have to go pay up front and get reimbursed? Are you going to allow, in some travel situations, that that you have a person designated to do your travel arrangements and pay for those on a county credit card? All of those things need to be considered when you're putting that policy together. Things like registration fees. And then again, in the policy for any of this, but especially for out-of-state or the overnight travel, if you've made reservations, airline reservations, hotel reservations, and the meeting gets canceled, or the person is not able to attend, they have an emergency in the family or an illness, how are you going to deal with that? What are they responsible for? What procedures need to be followed when that kind of thing happens? And those do happen, so you need to make sure that that your policy does address all of that. Okay. And I think we're now at break time, so I'm going to go ahead and let you guys go. We need to be back. Okay, we're going to finish up travel, and then Gail has a few announcements to make, and then we'll set you free. A few of the points we were still talking about on the policy, you can always take into consideration what the state rate is or the federal rates. You're not bound by that, but those are considerations you can look at. But do remember, if you do pay a mileage that's higher than the federal rate, there might be reporting requirements for that because that can be considered compensation. So bear that in mind when you're making your decisions. Okay. An area we frequently get questions about is taxes on hotel bills, specifically the sales tax. There's a lot of confusion because what is standard practice runs contrary to what Department of Revenue has determined is appropriate. Many of you do pay your hotel bill with either a county credit card or have the county clerk check written in advance of your arrival. And in doing so, the hotel will often exclude the cost of the sales tax. As you know, governmental units are exempt, are eligible for an exemption from state sales tax. However, when an employee makes a purchase, even if it's for a county purchase, they're not going to have that exemption as an individual. So if you use the county credit cards, the county checks, sometimes the hotels will exempt that or remove that sales tax. It's not a blanket exception. There is Indiana Department of Revenue Bulletin number 4. It was updated in September 2011. You can find it on their website. If you go to the www.in.gov/DOR under the tax library and information bulletins, it will bring up a menu of all of those bulletins. If you look for the number 4 under sales tax, you can get the specific Department of Revenue. One qualifier is that the purchase, to be exempt from the sales tax, the purchase must be invoiced directly to the governmental unit. The other is that the purchase is used primarily for a traditionally governmental function. That traditional governmental function is basically what you expect. It's your police, your fire protection, your general governmental business that your offices perform. And primarily is defined that is used more than 50% of the time in the performance of that function. Our understanding is that the Department of Revenue has determined that a person staying at a hotel, even when for a business function, is a purchase for the individual benefit and no sales tax, and so sales tax does apply in those cases. There have been hotels who have been audited by Department of Revenue based on their audits, are now including sales tax on the hotel bills of governmental employees, even when they're on governmental business, regardless of whether it's a credit card or they're paying their own way. And we've received in the last few years a lot of emails and phone calls about this. It really is a Department of Revenue decision on application, the proper application of sales tax. So if you have questions about it, you need to just refer those questions to the Department of Revenue. However, we will not take audit exception to a payment of sales tax for hotels, in-state or out-state. So we'll leave that part of it, but if you have a question about the application of sales tax, you really need to discuss it with Department of Revenue. Okay, we talked before when I started that there are some situations where statute governs the travel. We're going to go over these, and the slides are available. I want to keep them for future reference. And in these cases, the statute does supersede any local policy. Sometimes we get calls whether a particular meeting falls under one of these statutes. When we send you the confirmation notice, we put that information right in that letter. Hopefully other departments do that as well. If there is not sufficient information to let you know which statute applies, you will need to pursue it. Either your office needs to pursue it or have the employee that's claiming the reimbursement pursue it from whoever presented that training that they were attending. The first one that's up here is, of course, the most important. That's why it's first, sort of. And those are our State Board of Accounts meetings. You can find this under Indiana Code 5-11-14-1. On mileage, it states that it is at the rate determined by the fiscal body. In other words, it is your county's mileage rate. The lodging is for each night preceding the conference. It is equal to the single room rate. We have been asked whether you can be forced to share a room. There may be a county policy to that effect, but for our state-called meetings, it's the single room rate. In the case of a one-day conference, it is allowed only for those who reside more than 50 miles or further from the conference site. Subsistence for meals purchased while attending the conference, it is again reimbursed as determined by the fiscal body. Your county policy still rules. Payment shall be made from the general fund. It does not need to be appropriated. Registration is not specifically addressed in this statute. It has been pointed out that the cost is mostly for meals. We have not taken exception to payment from the general fund for the registration. DLGF instructional meetings are found under Indiana Code 6-1.1-35-3. Attendees to these kind of meetings are your township assessors, county assessors, members of the County Property Tax Assessment Board of Appeals, county auditors, and their employees. Mileage is at the state mileage rate. Lodging for each night preceding the session attendance is not less than the lodging equal to the lesser of A, the cost of a standard room rate at the hotel where the session is held, or B, the actual cost of the lodging paid. Just like the State Board of Accounts, if it is a one-day instructional meeting, then the lodging may be paid only for those 50 miles or more away from the meeting. Subsistence can't be less than what is allowed for state employees, but not more than the maximum subsistence allowed permitted under the regulations of the General Service Administration for federal employees in travel status as reported in the Federal Register. The amount is to be established by the fiscal body. It has to be within that range, but your policy determines what the specific amount is within that range. Parking is an allowance equal to the cost of parking at the convention site. Payment from the general fund, not otherwise appropriated. DLGF training / continuing education training is under Indiana Code 6-1.1-35.2-2 and Indiana Code 6-1.1-35-2.3. Attendees for these meetings are assessing officials and hearing officers for the County Property Tax Assessment Board of Appeals. Mileage allowance and per diem is set by DLGF. You can find this under the Indiana Administrative Code, so it's IAC 50, Article 20. Mileage rate is set by your county fiscal body. It defaults to the state rate if it is not set. The person is entitled to travel only between the person's place of work and the training session nearest to the person's place of work. Meal and lodging is set by county fiscal. It does default to state travel policies if your county has not set a policy on this. Payment can be made or may be made from unappropriated cumulative reassessment fund or unappropriated general fund. The Indiana Election Commission, this is under Indiana Code 3-6-4.2-14. Your attendees are members of the county election boards, boards of registration, and circuit court clerks. The mileage is at the state rate for the distance necessarily traveled in going and returning from the place of the instructional meeting. The lodging for each night preceding the conference attendance equal to the lodging allowance provided to state employees in their travel status. Subsistence, a per diem of $24. Registration fee, allowances made for the registration fee, and payments can be from the may be from the general fund without appropriation. Attorney General called meetings. The attendees to these meetings are prosecuting attorneys. Indiana Code 33-39-6-1, Section E, states in part, the expenses necessarily incurred by a prosecuting attorney in attending a conference, including the actual expense of transportation to and from the place where the conference is held, together with meals and lodging, shall be paid from the general fund of the county upon the presentation of an itemized and verified claim. You need to look to attendance confirmation letters to define those reimbursements. And if they do not provide those, then we will not take audit exception to using the rates that are set by the county fiscal body. Again, we won't take exception to payment from unappropriated general fund. Okay, this is a new legislation that's going into effect. It was enacted under House Bill 1006. It added a statute for joint judicial conferences for probation officers, judges that are administrating probation, community corrections officers, and employees, prosecuting attorneys, and defense attorneys. The expenses of the probation officers and judges shall be paid in the same manner as other expenses are paid in the courts in which they serve. The expenses of community corrections officers and employees may be paid by the county in the same manner as other county employees' expenses are paid. And our last, oops, I went too far. Our last slide does include the current state rates that are in effect, so you have those. And the website is at the bottom where you can get updated amounts if they change. They haven't changed for a long time, but they could change. Last year, we started talking a little bit more about internal controls, and as Debbie mentioned the new legislation and Paul mentioned, that it's going to be a topic that you're going to get increasing training on. And so we want you to start thinking about internal controls. I think Debbie mentioned you have the controls a lot of times in place, you just don't think about them that way, or they may not be totally formalized. And so what I wanted to do is go over some of the 5 components of the internal controls that we talked about last year and kind of relate them to travel to kind of make some sort of connection. The things I'm pulling out are just, these are not required controls. We don't, there are required controls in statute, but these are not required controls. These are just things, examples. So take them for what they're worth, or help you think about other things, or do some brainstorming in your own counties. Okay. And internal controls basically are your people, your policies, and your procedures that you put in place to make sure that your counties achieve the goals they want to achieve. And for governments, that is usually that you have your operations, which is the most efficient and effective use of your of providing the governmental services that your office is required to provide. It is also a way to safeguard your county assets. It's a way to, and the second 2 have to do with reporting and compliance, that you provide accurate reports, whether they're your annual financial reports at the end of the year or any other reports that you're required to provide throughout the year. And compliance, whether it's compliance with federal law, federal regulations, grant requirements, state law, your own local ordinances, bond agreements. There's a lot of things that you can become, that you are required to have compliance with. And Tammy, again, if you ever, the presentation is still on our website from the internal control presentation from last year. So if you might want to look at that again, she went over, there are 5 components for internal control, and I'm just going to do the 5 components. I'm not going to talk about the individual, necessarily the individual. I think there's 19, I can't even remember now, so I'm not going over those individual principles. The 5 components are control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. And they have to all work together for your internal controls to work. A lot of times we think the control activities is really all there is, and it's a component of it, but it all has to work together. The first component, control environment, and as you know, this is often referred to as tone at the top. And so you can set the tone for your office, but obviously for the county, you're going to have to have more cooperation with the council and with your governing bodies, the council and the commissioners on that. But you need to understand that you can have the most perfectly designed internal control activities. And if you do not have a control environment that also is designed and functioning properly, those control activities are going to fail. It's going to involve a commitment by the governing boards and by other offices that they are committing to ethics and integrity. One of the ways to move towards an effective internal control is to develop a county ethics policy, and they talked about that last July when they brought in and did the training on that. It's really, really important that you think about that and consider getting an ethics policy established. And of course, you need to lead by example. The control environment as affects to travel. One of the things you can look at is how is the control environment work effectively or not, is how are violations dealt with. So if I actually once audited, it was not a county, but I once audited a place where an employee had written on a piece of paper, I traveled 256 miles in the last 6 months, and it was paid. And that was not in compliance with their travel policy, believe it or not. But you know, how are those violations handled? So if that employee, as far as he knows, he was in, you know, what he did was fine because there was nothing ever brought back to him and said, this is not sufficient information. It got through the claims process, it got through the board that approved that claim. And it wasn't until the audit that we're saying, you know, here's an issue. This is not in compliance with your policy. We get a lot of calls, not a lot, we get some calls where people are trying to, you know, get some guidance, but also to register some complaints. And a lot of times we will ask, you know, have you talked to your county auditor about that? Have you talked to your commissioners about that? And sometimes the answer we get is they don't care. Now, I don't believe that because every single time it's possible, and for some counties that might be true, but I don't believe that. But I think the really important thing about your control environment, especially for your office, is that your employees know you do care, that this is important, that you're not going to look the other way or shrug it off, or you know, if they bring an issue to you, that you do care, that the policies that are issued are being adhered to. The next is risk assessment. This is an ongoing process, and as I said, we kind of define our objectives as the operations, the reporting, and the compliance. A risk is anything that's going to prevent you from achieving that objective, from operating your office, from compiling an accurate report, from complying with all of those regulations or grant agreements or anything that you have to comply with. And so every time, it's almost a constant process when you're looking at things. What are the risks that this is going to be done? So from a travel perspective, your thinking along that line is, what is the risk that a claim for travel reimbursement will be paid when it is in fact not county business? Examples that we've actually gotten questions are, have been seen before, the spouse goes along and they're included on the meal receipt. What is the risk that's going to get through and get paid and you're not going to catch that? A personal expense on a hotel bill. What's the risk that that's going to go through and no one's going to catch that that's on there? The hotel bill covers more days than the convention did. Again, what is the risk that that's just going to get sent on through? And so that's what risk assessment, and just with travel, but that's what risk assessment is. What are the risks to what's being issued? Once you determine the risks, you can start doing your control activities, which is how you address those risks. So a policy that you're going to establish defines your expectations, and the procedures will outline the specific actions that are needed to be performed. For example, this is just an example, we say you decide for your county policy that all out-of-state travel will require pre-approval from your department head or your office holder. That's your policy, and it's in your county policy. Your procedures would be that you could enact. So the employee will complete a travel request form. They'll remit it to the appropriate office holder or department head, get it signed, dated, and included on that claim for reimbursement when that comes through. That would be your procedure to meet your policy. So that's why a clearly written policy that is established for your county is really, really important, because you're starting with your policy and you're going to set your procedures based on what that policy says. And you are going to audit your claims in compliance with that in the same way we do. And I think I said it earlier when I was talking to somebody, if you're looking at a claim and you're not sure it should be paid, I guarantee you when it comes up for audit, they're going to have the same questions. So address it then. That should be part of your control procedures. Whoever in your office is responsible for auditing travel claims, make sure they know that if something doesn't look right, that you investigate. You may still pay it, but maybe it needs some further investigation or some further approval, and that's where your policies and your control activities come in place to govern those. The next one is information and communication. Once you've established your policy and your procedures, how is anyone going to know what those are? So where's your information located? Is it written? Is it in an employee manual? Is it on your website? Do they have, is it handed out as a directive? How are you going to get that information out? How is anyone going to know when it's changed or updated? Is there going to be a staff emailing saying, hey, at the last commissioners meeting we updated the travel policy, you need to be aware of this, something that's going to get that information out. And communication should also be a two-way street. If someone knows that there are issues with a policy or with procedures that are being overridden or violated, that information is coming back up the chain so that those issues can be addressed. So for travel, again, whoever is responsible for auditing those travel claims, they need to know what the policy is, how to apply that policy, who to go to if they have questions or something doesn't look right or doesn't follow or isn't addressed by the policy. And all of those need to be established, and they need to be communicated. And again, the updates need also to be communicated. The final one is monitoring. You're monitoring your controls to determine if they are effective, if they're implemented properly, and if they're effective. So you're looking for things like, are there places where someone is overriding these controls, where someone is, or they're not properly designed, they're not catching the problems that we identified in our risk assessment, and so need to be modified. You also have to look at their design and be able to modify them as needed. You can't just set a policy and forget it. I think I feel like I'm saying that over and over again, that you need to be a little more flexible so that you are always addressing things as they come up. My example for travel, and this is going to date me, the Form 101 is the required form for mileage reimbursement, which everybody loves and probably has extra copies of. Back in the day, and I'm talking back in the early 80s, we filled those forms out manually, and sometimes you still do that, sometimes you have electronic versions, and you would fill out every single address and your odometer reading and the purpose for your visit and each individual and total your mileage, and then you signed it to certify it. You turned that in to whoever was your direct supervisor then that would review it and approve it and submit it for payment. The only way to check those claims back in the 80s, and it was done, is if your supervisor or someone wanted to either if there was a control procedure to check it or felt that it didn't look right, was to redrive that route. And it has been done in places. They would go back out and redrive it, and people have been terminated for falsifying those claims because when their supervisor went out to re-travel it, they found that they were fudging the numbers a little bit or doubling the amount of what they were traveling. It's not a horrible control, but now that we have all this wonderful technology, you can pull up MapQuest or some similar website. You can put the address in, and you can spot check it right then without having to go out and do that, which is infinitely a better use of your time. And so you just need to keep in mind, I think that's kind of an extreme thing, but you need to keep in mind that as your technology improves, you may be able to upgrade your controls or change them to meet with the technology. Controls should not be busy work. We don't, even the ones that are required by statute, if they don't always make sense, they do have a purpose. They are addressing a specific risk. And part of, I think, when I talked about the information and communication being a two-way street, if you have someone in your county that's coming back to you and is saying, you know, this is just, it's a pain, I don't see any purpose, it's wasted time, it doesn't hurt to relook at that, look at what those procedures are, and it is possible there may be a more efficient way to get that risk assessed, addressed that you had identified. But you need to specifically be looking at what was the purpose of that procedure when it was originally designed, and whatever your new modified procedures are, do they still address that same risk? But it is possible that sometimes we do things because we've always done it that way, and there may be a more efficient way to use that. So that is my very brief attempt to give you some ideas of what internal controls are like. Are there any questions? Oh, great. It's the end of the day. Nobody cares. Gail is going to come up and talk.